Hey guys, today I want to focus on something very specific. It has to do with de-essing, or also known as high frequency limiting. And I want to use it in a way that is not so intuitive, because I don't want to use it just for taking away any type of S's on vocals or anything that's particular in the upper frequencies. What I want to use it for is to soften everything in the upper mids and the highs strategically, so I don't have to work the EQ as hard, as a part of the global sound. So not something that's so specific to fix anything, but rather something that's going to just enhance the processes and to create a situation so I don't have to rely on one single piece of processing, maybe EQ, to work as hard. That's going to create maybe a little less connectivity with how I'm going to ingest this music. And if I sliver in some high frequency limiting, it's going to allow me to have an EQ shape that's not so curved, because the more you process generally, the more disconnected you'll feel from the music. And that's just a very simple rule of thumb that's been established well before my time, and it's been around for a long, long time. Generally, less is more when it comes to processing audio, unless you're using processing for musical purposes deliberately. But if you just want to go through processes just because you feel like you have to, you're usually going to end up in a place of where you're getting less in the end. So what I'm going to do to demonstrate this is master this track from the Samson brothers. It's called We Live This Life. Really, really cool, beautiful song. And I want to master it without any high frequency limiting in the chain, which is something that I would normally have as just a kind of a default starting point, especially for an arrangement like this, as something that I would rely on to EQ into. But I want to do it without it first, just to show you as an example what road I would end up going down without that part of the process in the chain. And then once that's done, I'm going to introduce it, which is going to end up in a place where it's just going to be a little bit more easy to listen to. It's going to come into me a little bit more fluid, if you will. So first things first, let's just get ourselves familiar with this song. I'm going to really focus in on the last section of the song, just listen flat, and then I'm going to EQ everything without that high frequency limiter. So my chain is going to be fairly simple, actually. These two EQs working off each other, 1, 2, 1 solid state, feeding into, it's actually not so simple, feeding into compression. Today I'm going to use the Shadow Hills. And then from there, I'm going to go directly into this Allen Smart C1 compressor just to hold everything together, and then convert back to digital on the back end with a little bit of brickwall digital limiting post-conversion. So that's what we're going to be listening through, and that's what we're going to be EQing into. And then once that's done, I'm going to redo the whole thing with the addition of the high frequency limiting. So here we are. Here's the flat song down. All right, so first instincts. It's a very simple arrangement, and it's acoustic guitars, and there's vocals, but there's a percussive element, and it's really just on the beat, right? And that percussive element is taking up the low potential for the low end support of this track. It's not there yet on the flat mix, but we can emphasize that through EQ to really create some nice support. But there's also an upper part of that percussive element, which is on top of the vocal, a little bit higher than the vocal, which I'm going to want to rein in a little bit. And there's also it's nothing harsh, it's nothing edgy, there's no problems with this mix, but there is some upper part of that guitar that's not as supported as I'd like it. So I'm going to work on all of that right now and show you where I want to take it, again, without the high frequency limiting. So here we go. So right away, you can see that what I'm doing is emphasizing 120 on these pretty wide cues. of this EQ. So 120, it's also boosting probably all the way down to like 70 and up above around maybe even 200. So it's pretty wide, right? That's being emphasized, which is creating that support. So with that percussive element and that bass that's with that percussive element on the guitars, it's creating this nice pillow for everything to sit on. I'm also emphasizing down around 60, less so around 3K, tucking that in, which is only further emphasizing the bottom, right? Because as I pull back 3K, it's essentially emphasizing everything below it. It's also emphasizing everything above it to some degree too, but it's really emphasizing where I'm kind of tilting everything to create this nice support in the low and the low mid. And then just not emphasizing or de-emphasizing around 6K just to make sure that vocal is where I want it, and then also around 10K on a shelf just to make sure that everything's nice and open. So really what I'm doing is just emphasizing the bottom and the low mids by this into the compression, and I'm happier, but I'm not fully happy. So let's listen to this one more time. We'll also print it because we're going to be able to compare against it momentarily. And it's pretty good, but it's not 100% for me yet because the guitars are a little bit wild. They're not really contained, and it's a little bit loose for me. I'm not really fully connecting to the song because I just know that it has more potential. So now what I'm going to do is reintroduce this high frequency limiter, and we're going to get happy in that place with the addition of that, and you're going to find that I'm probably going to have to EQ it a little bit less so because that bottom that I found with EQ is going to be to some degree found with the high frequency limiting, and everything's going to work in conjunction with everything else. And I'll probably, just from doing this for so long, I know that I'm not going to have to rely on the EQ so much, and some of that heavy lifting is going to be taken over from the high frequency limiting, and in the end it's just going to be a little bit more controlled up top. It's going to feel a little bit more lush, and hopefully so you can just reach out and touch the music with your hands. That's what we're going for. We want to feel like we're connected with it. So I'm going to patch it in. We're going to see where we are. All right, so what am I doing with this high frequency limiter? It's not just a set and forget type of thing, although in this case it kind of is. And believe it or not, it's actually limiting, high frequency limiting, all the way down towards 2.4K. That's pretty low. That's not the high frequencies, that's actually the mids in a way. It's certainly the high mids. It's pretty low. So it's creating a nice blanket over everything around 2.4 and above. It's a soft blanket just to soften the edge and allows me to then EQ into it. It's not just shaping that, it's also because it's shaping the upper mids up into the highs, it's also influencing what's going on in the lows down below. So all of that is happening, and it's just a gentle amount of high frequency limiting. You can play with this type of thing with any type of high frequency limiter that you might have at your disposal digitally, but I like to work them pretty low, around 2.4, and then just gently, and you can play with the threshold in terms of how far you want that to work. Going too far will end up in a place where it feels like it's masked. The life up top is missing. It's sounding tubby, it's sounding squished, it's sounding like it's working too hard. Not working hard enough, it's going to expose the point or the edge. Maybe something's not even edgy in the arrangement, but it's not quite hugging the way you want. These are the things to zero in on in terms of how to narrow down where you want to set your high frequency limiting. Okay, so the high frequency limiter, de-esser, is now in the signal path, and we're going to start over. Everything else in the chain is going to remain the same. It's just this addition now. I'm going to go back because I want to hear this without any thing influencing my decisions. And this is a big part of mastering, to make sure that you maintain your perspective and not have something skewing your perspective. Because if you sit in front of some speakers for 3 hours with, really, really bright music coming out of the speakers, maybe you just roll off all the bottom and you sit in front of those speakers for a long time, your ears are going to get a little skewed, getting used to that brightness. And then that wrongness is going to start sounding right to you. It won't happen to me, but somebody that with less experience might end up down those roads. And just my experience is telling me always to just maintain that center focus down the center road. And it's probably because my younger self has learned better to not let yourself go off and your ears can play tricks on you. So a good mastering engineer knows that. Any engineer really knows that about audio. In other words, don't work the next day after you've gone to a big rock concert. All right, so here we go. Let me EQ this and see where we are. All right, so I'm fairly happy with this. It introduces that missing little ingredient that I was hoping to find with EQ, but knowing that it would be better found with some high frequency limiting. And now that we're going to A/B between the first print that we experimented without the high frequency limiting versus what we have on the board now with the high frequency limiting, you're going to notice a few things. You're going to notice that the little point on top of the guitars are now softened, putting your ear a little bit more towards the vocal. And you're going to notice a little bit of extra nice pillowy support on the low part of the guitars and not having to rely on the EQ. In fact, I'm actually, because of the high frequency limiting in there, pushing the amount of support downwards so it envelops a little bit of the low frequency. I'm actually EQing a little bit less down at 60 and probably around the same area, an amount around 120. And then opening up more with EQ around 6K because I'm able to without it getting pointed or hard. So the whole shape of my EQ into the compression dynamic shaping processes that come post EQ are being altered based off what I'm pushing into. So this is exactly what I want to have. And now let's do an A/B between the two. First print without frequency, high frequency limiting, and the second, what's on the board right now, with. Cool. So I'm grooving to that. Now, one thing to be aware of too is brighter always can sound better maybe or seductive if you're A/Bing against something darker. So my experience is telling me that the darker one, the second one that we have now, is actually more balanced just because I know it is based off doing this for so long. But if you're not really versed in this stuff, you can always lean towards brighter because brighter, it just sounds better unless you know what you're doing. Just to be aware of, just as an anecdote. To not be seduced by brightness, because it can happen if you're not totally locked in on your speakers especially, or your processes. So anyway, I hope this was a good example of how to show you that introducing processes that might not be as intuitive as you might think could be certainly beneficial along the way down whatever you're trying to achieve, because essentially what you want to try to achieve is not having your gear work harder than it needs to work, even if that means introducing another process. Sometimes introducing another process ends up sounding less processed in the end. As confusing, as weird as that sounds, it's certainly true in mastering. So please leave some questions or comments below if you have them. I'd love to interact with you guys on this topic. It's something that is always interesting to me, and I hope you guys will find this useful in your mastering adventures.